Did you, as a team with editors, did you conceptualize this series before you each set out to write the pieces that you did? Or did you find the stories and then say, I think we have, how did it come about? Or say, we think we have an idea, we can package this.
I think that I mean, Marjorie would know better than I, but I think that, I mean, at least from my perspective, we were looking at individual stories. Mm-hmm. And then I think we kind of realized that there was this common theme that was running across multiple continents, that, you know, whether it was going on in Yemen and Djibouti, or whether it was in Mexico or Honduras or wherever, that there was this way to shift the America's immigration policy to the rest of the world. And we found that we were covering basically the same story in a whole bunch of different places. And then it very naturally sort of wove together into a package.
Lori, can you talk a little bit about how the piece that you wrote from Libya, how you tracked really the follow the money, where you managed to find out that the donations from the EU handed and distributed through the UN in Libya were being misused, and in some cases were contributing to migrants being tortured, beaten up, sold as if they were slaves. Can you tell us a little bit about the follow the money trail, what that revealed?
Well, that started actually the year before with some reporting that I had done on migration. And I started thinking a lot about how Europe had essentially, with this enormous, many hundreds of million euro trust fund, outsourced its migration policy to anyone else because it couldn't come up with its own migration policy. The European governments couldn't agree, so they figured better just let someone else deal with our problem. And so it was hundreds of millions of euros. And every time I would go ask someone in Brussels, what are you spending it on? I couldn't get an answer. And so it seemed to me that there was this enormous slush fund that was going who knew where. And it very quickly became apparent that Libya was the largest recipient of this enormous fund, followed closely, I think, by Niger. Mm-hmm. But in Niger, you could kind of see where the money was going. In Libya, no one knew. And so we pulled as many budget documents that were available as possible, which was not that many. But the International Organization for Migration briefly left a small window open where they put all their budget documents online. And so we grabbed those and just started trying to look up the companies that they had paid in Libya, and quickly realized that these companies didn't exist anywhere. And we would call, so we were, Maggie, Michelle, and I started just calling people and saying, have you ever heard of this company? Who owns it? And slowly we just started essentially tracing back who might control them by figuring out where these essentially shell companies were. And around the same time, the UN opened what they called Europe's alternative to detention, because Libya jails thousands and thousands of migrants in horrific detention centers run by their interior ministry. The UN opened a center in Tripoli that was supposed to be the alternative to these places where torture was widespread, where malnutrition was widespread, where people were dying. And the amounts of money going into this UN center were vast. In the center of Tripoli, which at that point, by spring, was in the middle of a civil war. So it quickly became clear that we needed to focus on this center, because this was both being run by the UN and funded by the EU. So Maggie actually went into Tripoli. It took us a lot. I went into Tunisia to figure out essentially where the money was going there, because most of the Libyan money goes through Tunisia at some point.
Right, they were using Tunisia as a place to launder the money. The people who were benefiting from the donations or from the human trafficking were then using Tunisia. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah, and there's entire neighborhoods of Tunis that Tunisians, look around and say, look, this is a Libyan neighborhood, and you see these extremely exotic cars, murdered out black paint that are with Libyan plates. So you could see the money is everywhere. And that's also where all of the UN agencies are based, and all of the EU agencies, and everybody is based in Tunis because Libya is too dangerous. So all the money is going through Tunis. And you could go down to the border and see where people were washing up on shore when their boats didn't make it. Maggie went to Tripoli and started trying to pull together the Libyan side of the documents there, and really trying to figure out who was profiting from these hundreds of millions of euros that were Europe's answer to what do we do with our migrants? We pay the Libyans.
Mm-hmm. And when you went to the European Union or to the UN, what was their response?
Well, the European Union's response then, as it is now, is that they give all of the money to what they call their trusted partners, which is primarily the UN agencies, UNHCR, the UN High Commission on Refugees, or the International Organization on Migration, plus to a lesser extent, some of the smaller international organizations. And they trust those agencies to find Libyan partners, is how they then describe it. Initially, and IOM and UNHCR were pressed really hard on this story, and they believe, I genuinely think they believe that they're doing the best they can under very difficult circumstances. But by the time we finished the reporting and had actually directly traced the European money to this militia leader who had been himself torturing and starving migrants, it was very clear that there was not oversight.
Right.
And when there was oversight, people were looking the other way. So it was interesting because UNHCR actually changed their policy. Our last week of reporting, when we were finishing up the story, we had been pressing them for what was their response to the fact that we'd found that this money was being diverted to this militia leader and diverted to places that was the exact opposite of what they had hoped to accomplish. And they changed their policy and made it so that money could not be paid directly to Libyan partners. And then after that, Tripoli fell into utter chaos and they closed the center that had been the focus of our investigation.
So what happened to the migrants if that center is closed?
That is what's even harder, is the UNHCR gives migrants essentially a stipend, and the migrants scattered. They went through Tripoli. Many of them, I think, ended up back in detention. Many of them said they had no choice but to try to cross to Europe because the alternative was going into detention in Libya or being kidnapped for ransom, which was the alternative. Leaving Libya was almost impossible for most of them, unless they were lucky enough to get caught into the IOM system of repatriation. But many of them, particularly those from Sudan or Eritrea, of which there were many, going home wasn't an option. If you're from Darfur, you can't go home, even if the Sudanese government would take you, even if you have passports. Eritrea, the same issue. There was no home for them to go to. So they were just trapped waiting for something to change, even though they had no great hope that anything would.
I think one of the things that this series did well was show that migrants originate in one place, but then they go all over to try to get to a destination. It's not that from Libya, Libyans are coming, or from Mexico, it's only Latin Americans. I think you had Africans who had somehow found their way to Mexico to cross into the US, and the story about Yemen, how they were, because they couldn't get to Europe, they were redirected to Yemen, and from Yemen they were going to Saudi Arabia. So really a global population on the move and stuck in limbo.